Hello, this is the luckiest maths teacher in the world. Thank you so much for tuning into this video in which we will go through everything you need to know for the upcoming test on equations, and there's also some substitution. So what is an equation? Well, equation is something like this that has an equal sign. We want to solve equations. That means we want to find a value that we can substitute for this pronumeral that makes this a true statement. So this is a one-step equation because you only need to do one thing in order to solve it. See, the idea here is that the pronumeral will have had some operations done to it. You need to undo those operations to make x, or the pronumeral, the subject of the equation. You need to undo what's been done to x so that you get x by itself. So here we've taken x and divided by 7. This line here means divided by. So the way that we can undo that is just by timesing each side by 7. X is just 5 times 7, which is 35. Now 35 is the solution because if I take my equation x over 7 equals 5, and I substitute x for 35, that means I swap or exchange x for 35, I get a true statement. 35 divided 7 equals 5. So for all the equations that we're looking at, you can check your answer by substituting it into the original equation and seeing if it gets a true statement. So all of the equations we do have only one solution. So that was actually quite an easy equation, but we'll look at a couple of harder equations. So these are harder because in both of these, x, the pronumeral, has had many operations performed on it. So it's important that we get the order of operations right. So the analogy I always use is socks and shoes. In the morning, you put on your socks first, then your shoes. At night, you need to take off your shoes first because they're the last thing you put on. And so it is with these equations here. See, in this equation, we actually subtracted 3, then divided by 4, then added 1. But when we're solving, we need to undo things in the opposite order. So this can be very tricky to keep track of which operations you're undoing when. So we went through two methods in class, the flowchart method and the balance method. Both of them are just designed to help you keep track of which operations you're undoing. So for this one, I'll perform the flowchart method. So the flowchart method, you start off by just telling the story of what happened to x. We started with this random number x we don't yet know, and let's say what happened to it. Well, first thing I did was subtract 3. That's how I got this x minus 3. Then we divided by 4. That's why there's this over 4 here. And then the last thing we did was add 1. So then we got somehow this answer of 9. So when you're doing flowchart method, the first flowchart here tells the story of what happened to x. When we're solving, we go the other way. We start at 9. So instead of adding 1, we do the opposite. Opposite of adding 1 is subtracting 1. So 9 minus 1 is 8. Now we come to here. This way, through this machine, we divide it by 4. So when you're going the opposite way, you do the opposite. The opposite of dividing by 4 is timesing by 4. So we take our number 8. We're like putting it through a times 4 machine. So we end up with 32. And finally, the opposite of subtracting 3 is adding 3. So we take our 32, we're like putting it through a plus 3 machine, and we get 35. So the answer you need to write like this: x equals 35. 35 is the solution because 35 minus 3 is 32. 32 divided 4 is 8. 8 plus 1 is 9. If you substitute x for 35 here, you get a true statement. So the flowchart just helps us keep track of the order of operations, because unfortunately, if you solve things in the wrong order, you'll get the wrong answer. So that was the flowchart method. Let's look at the balance method. The balance method essentially does the same thing. We still need to undo what's been done to x in the opposite order to BIDMAS. The idea behind the balance method method is what you do to one side of the equation, you must do to the other in order to keep the equation balanced. So here, because of the brackets, we've added 5 to x first, then times by 3, then divided by 2. So because dividing 2 is the last thing I did, it's the first thing I undo. I undo dividing by 2 by timesing by 2. They undo each other. If you divide a number by 2, then times your answer by 2, you're back where you started. So because I times this side of the equation by 2, I must multiply the other side of the equation by 2. And so I'm left with 3 side of x plus 5 is equal to 18 times 2, which is 36. So now I'm left with the plus 5 was done first, then times by 3. The last thing I did is the first thing I undo. This is like putting on our socks, then our shoes. We have to take our shoes off first. So the way I undo timesing by 3 is to divide each side by 3. Because times 3 and divide 3 undo each other. So I'm left with x plus 5 is equal to, now because I divided this side by 3, I must divide this side of the equation by 3. 36 divided by 3 gives me 12. So I just have x plus 5 equals 12. The way I undo adding 5 is to subtract 5, because subtracting 5 and adding 5 undo each other. If I subtract 5 from the left-hand side, I must subtract 5 from the right-hand side. So I'm just left with x equals 12 minus 5, which is 7. 7 is the solution because 7 plus 5 is 12. 12 times 3 is 36. 36 divided 2 is 18. If I substitute or swap x for 7, I get a true statement. So once again, you can check whether or not your solution is correct. So it doesn't matter whether you want to use the flowchart method or the balance method in this upcoming test. People generally find the flowchart method easier to understand, but unfortunately you will have to use the balance method in later years. So make a choice for yourself for this year, whether you want to go for the easier method or the harder method that you will have to use next year. All right, let's now look at applying what we've learned about equations to some worded problems. So now we're looking at worded problems. They're problems like this where you're given heaps of words, but you're not actually given the equation to solve. You always follow these 3 steps. Define a variable, form an equation, and then solve. So when I say define a variable, basically what I mean is let x, or whichever letter you like, be whatever you're trying to find. Always start by doing that. Then use that to set up an equation, and then you can use balance method or flowchart method, whichever one you like. So let's look at this question. Maths tutor charges $30 call-out fee, $50 per hour. How many hours must they work to earn $180? So it can be tricky to know where to start. But if you know these steps, you'll know your very first step is always let x be what you're trying to find. So here I'm trying to find the number of hours they must work. So I simply let x be the number of hours. That is step 1 done. So step 2 is form an equation. Basically that means I'm going to rewrite all of this information using only mathematical symbols and numbers. So what I'm going to do is rewrite this like $30 call out fee plus $50 per hour. $50 times the number of hours worked, and that gives us a total of 180. This actually says, much more succinctly however, the same information as the blue. It doesn't matter whether this person is a tutor, plumber, whatever. All that matters is they get $30 plus $50 per hour, and they want to earn 180. When you've got to this step, the hard work is done. You can solve either using the flowchart method or the balance method. So using the balance method for this, 30 plus 50x is 180. So x has been times by 50 first, then 30 has been added. We know we times by 50 first because that's BIDMAS. So because 30 was the last thing that we did, it's the first thing we undo. It's like the shoes put on. So I need to subtract 30 because 30 minus 30, they cancel each other out. Now, what I do to one side of the equation, I must do to the other. So I'm going to be left with 50x is equal to 180 minus 30. All right, I've got 50 times x. The way I undo timesing by 50 is to divide by 50, because timesing 50 and dividing 50 undo each other. So I'm just left with x equals 3. 150 divided 50 is 3. So after this, you should probably write a worded answer to show that you know what you found. So we found that x equals 3. X is the number of hours they must work. So this tutor must work for 3 hours, because then they will earn 3 times 50 plus 30. They'll earn 150 plus 30. They'll earn 180. So that's our final answer. All right, let's look at this one here. This one's a bit tougher. So the perimeter of a rectangle is 40 centimeters. Length is 14 centimeters more than the width. Calculate its dimensions. So this question is asking us to calculate the length and the width. So this one's harder because there are actually 2 unknown quantities. Now we're sort of going to follow the same steps, these 3 here. Our first step is to define a variable. So let's just let x equal 1 of the things we're trying to find. So we're trying to find width and length, so I will let x be the width. Now, it's really important when you have 2 unknown quantities, the width and the length in this question, don't use different letters to represent them. We don't know how to solve an equation that has 2 pronumerals. We don't know how to solve one that has, say, x's and y's. So when I'm writing the length, I don't want to let it be y. I need to write it in terms of x. So if the width was x and the length is 14 centimeters more, the length is x plus 14. This is just saying the length is whatever the width was plus 14. I have used the same pronumeral for both unknown quantities. I need to do that because we only know how to solve equations when there is 1 pronumeral. So that was hard. First step's done though. Now let's turn this into an equation. So we know that the perimeter of a rectangle is width plus length. It's all 4 sides added together, and there are basically 2 widths and 2 lengths. So we're told that width plus length must equal 40 centimeters. So we can make this a bit easier on ourselves. It looks pretty complicated as it is, but fortunately we have the algebra skills. We know x plus x plus x plus x is 4x. We also know 14 plus 14 is 28. So we have 4x plus 28 equals 40. Remember, of course, x and 14 can't be added together. They're not like terms. So let's solve this equation here. We can use flowchart or balance method. I'll use flowchart. So what we've done is we've started with some unknown number x. We have multiplied this number by 4. We got our answer. We added 28 and we ended up at 40. So when I'm solving, I want to do things in the opposite order. I start at 40. So instead of adding 28, I'm going to subtract 28. So now I'm going this way. I'm going to change the plus 28 to a minus 28. And of course, 40 minus 28 is 12. So now I'm going to go the opposite way through the times 4 machine. I'm not going to times 4. I'm going to divide by 4. So 12 divided by 4 gives us 3. The answer here is x equals 3. So what does that mean? That means x was the width, so the width is 3. The length is 17. And because everything was in centimeters, we have width is 3 centimeters, the length is 17 centimeters, and we're done. All right, let's just have a quick look back at substitution. So in addition to using substitution to check whether your solution to an equation is correct, you'll need to be able to do questions like this. So just a review, because I know we've done it a lot. You'll be given something like a equals negative 7, b equals negative 5, and told to calculate or evaluate something like this. So all you're doing with substitution is just exchanging. So I'm going to exchange a for negative 7. I put it in brackets. Whenever you substitute a negative, good idea to use brackets. And I'm going to replace here b with -5, again using brackets. So the value of this, so -7 squared, remember, is positive 49. If you square a negative, the answer is positive. Similarly, -5 squared, -5 times -5 is positive 25. So what we have here is the square root of 49 minus 25 plus 1. So 49 minus 25 is 24, plus 1 is 25. Square root of 25 is saying what number do you times by itself to get 25, and that is 5. So 5 is our final answer. So this wasn't an equation, but there will be some substitution questions like that in the test. So this question here says if x is negative, that's what less than 0 means, and y is negative, is 3x plus y positive or negative? So you can expect that you will get a question or two in the test that asks you to explain something with mathematical reasoning. So you need to give a reason for it. So we know that if x is negative, 3x will also be negative. That's what this says here, because a positive times a negative is always negative. And I told you, x is some negative number. So what we have for 3x plus y, we have a negative plus a negative. So a negative plus a negative is negative. For example, if you do -7 plus -5, because the plus and minus turn into a great big minus, a subtraction, this would be -12. If you have a negative plus a negative, it is the same as a negative subtract a positive. Just like here, it's a negative subtract a positive, so the answer is always going to be negative. I want to make this point again, and I know it's confusing. 2 negatives make a positive. That's for multiplication or division. 2 negatives multiply or divide to give a positive answer, but if you have a negative plus a negative, the answer is still negative. All right, thank you so much for tuning into this video. Best of luck studying for the test. This has been the luckiest maths teacher in the world. Have a great day.